of Central Florida, you're listening to the most electrifying show in media. A Neighbor's Choice. I'm your host, your neighbor, David Gornoski. So glad to be with you again on this journey through the news and headlines of our time, guided by personhood principles, not this toxic groupthink keeping us down, keeping us in a low resolution way of thinking. We have to get past that, folks. And that's why we bring on the real leaders, the real bold thinkers, the people who are willing to challenge the status quo. Even when everybody's going the other direction, we have to be able to tell the truth. We have to have a country that's not allergic to truth and reality. So joining me to talk about foreign affairs is our frequent guest and someone who has been leading the charge on talking about the reality of the Ukraine conflict with sobriety, not hysteria. We have with us Colonel Douglas Macgregor. How you doing, sir?
Fine, David. How are you?
I'm great. You know, I saw this new piece you had in the American Conservative. It says Washington's Carthaginian peace collides with reality. And the subtext is the Biden administration refuses to tell the American people the truth. Ukraine is not winning and will not win this war. Can you give us a little overview of what you're trying to communicate in this article?
Oh, sure. Over the last several months, in fact, I would argue virtually from the 24th of February when the Russians first intervened, the tendency in the media has been to repeat ad nauseum whatever the Ukrainian government says and treat it as the truth. And let's be frank, from the outset, they've been telling everyone, well, the Ukrainians are winning, the Russians are losing. The Russians are losing tens of thousands of soldiers. They're losing hundreds of tanks and critical equipment, and the Russians can't do anything right, and the Russians are losing. Well, that has never really been true. Virtually from the beginning, the Russians went in with a fraction of the force that they had available because they assumed that we ultimately would negotiate and be interested in arranging a ceasefire and coming to some sort of agreement, because their principal interest, as you know, was always to have a neutral Ukraine. This didn't happen. And finally, in the summer, I think the leadership in Moscow decided we've got to change our approach. We have no choice. We have to treat Ukraine as a theater of war. And that's what they've done. They have absolutely turned Ukraine into a theater of war, and they have changed their approach 180 degrees from what it was. The Ukrainians have been losing hundreds of thousands of men as casualties. We estimate they've had 400,000 casualties, of which over 100,000 are dead. Now, very recently, Ursula von der Leyen, who is the president of the European Union, actually admitted that the Ukrainians had lost at least 100,000 dead. The truth is that over the last several months, the losses have been so heavy that we think it's probably closer now to about 120 to 125,000. And the second part of this, of course, is that the Europeans, and we to a large extent, have run out of ammunition and equipment to send to them. We're now talking about building new equipment that could be sent over and stripping out whatever we can find from many of our own units, to the point where, frankly, if we had to fight a war in Central Europe, we'd be in trouble. We're down to days, maybe a couple of weeks of ammunition. The Russians have always been accused of running out of rockets, running out of missiles, running out of ammunition, and nothing could be further from the truth. They've been running out of tanks, and again, nothing could be further from the truth. The Russians now have set up a very effective defense while they build up for massive offensive operations in December and January. And those buildups are almost complete. We can account now, as I pointed out in the op-ed, for about 540,000 troops, 1,500 tanks, another 3,000 plus armored fighting vehicles, hundreds of guns, 1,000 rocket and drone strike systems, hundreds of fixed-wing aircraft, and hundreds of helicopters. The bottom line is that the Russians are now going to war, and the Ukrainians are frankly, on the ropes. All of their sophisticated equipment, their rocket artillery systems, what few they have left, are operated now by Americans and British contractors. They don't have the trained personnel to do anything. So Ukraine is really in a lot of trouble, and that's why Zelensky is working very, very hard to convince everybody that we should give our last full measure for Ukraine. But it's not going to work, and Ukraine is going to be destroyed. And as we've seen from the new missile strikes, the energy grid is almost completely gone. Electricity is almost totally absent. Water, food, all the amenities that make life bearable are missing. And millions of Ukrainians are now leaving Ukraine because they cannot live where they are. We should really be interested in easing the burden on the Ukrainians. And that burden will not be eased by supplying more arms that the Russians will simply destroy or capture. It will be eased by negotiations in which the West has to concede territory to Russia and agree to a non-NATO status, in other words, a neutral status for Ukraine. Nobody wants to do that, so under the circumstances, Ukraine is doomed.
Yeah, I'm looking at this story in Al Jazeera. U.S. and France pledge Ukraine support amid Russia's brutal war, but they're vowing to hold Russia accountable for atrocities and war crimes in its invasion of Ukraine, the headline says.
Yeah. What's really depressing is that all of the things the Ukrainians have accused the Russians of doing are things the Ukrainians themselves have done. Ukrainian soldiers have actively posted video of Russian prisoners of war being executed. The Russians have not executed any prisoners of war. Quite the contrary. They've actually behaved remarkably well. And Putin has been absolutely insistent that they not kill civilians. The problem is that they were so careful in the past and so anxious to avoid damaged infrastructure that people thought they were weak. Well, that's now over. They are willing to accept collateral damage if they can destroy ammunition and storage points, fuel systems, and electricity. They will do that, and that's what's happening right now. And soon I think they'll move on to transportation infrastructure, bridges, roads, and these kinds of things to ensure that the Ukrainians cannot resupply themselves. And right now they're virtually at a standstill anyway. They have no diesel. They have no fuel. What fuel they have is going into generators to heat buildings and homes. So, everybody's pledging more and more and more, but the truth is, David, not much is arriving. There just isn't much to send anymore. So the real point is, if anybody cares about the Ukrainian people, if people want to see Ukraine as a nation state survive, we need to talk with the Russians, and no one seems to be willing to do that.
Why? I mean, is there anybody we heard, you said no one wants to talk to Russians, but what about the story about Milley, General Milley trying to reach out and do something about peace and so forth? I mean, isn't there any...
General Milley's job is the senior advisor to the President of the United States. He has no authority to reach out to anybody.
Right.
That's one of the problems that General Milley has. He seems to think he's got authority that he doesn't. What he did is that he leaked to the New York Times comments that he made to President Biden. Incidentally, he leaked information that he had shared with President Trump when he was in office. He seems to do that in the hopes that this will somehow or another elevate his position. It's the wrong thing to do, but in the course of leaking to the New York Times, apparently he leaked this information because just as President Trump had rejected his advice on one or two occasions, you have the same thing happening now with President Biden. And when he suggested that the Ukrainians had done all that they could reasonably expected to do, and this was probably the right time to negotiate, he was told, forget it, out of the question. We're not negotiating with the Russians. And he didn't like it, and so he decided to leak it. Well, within 24 hours, he was obviously reprimanded, and he went public and recanted everything that he had said and talked again about fighting until the last Ukrainian is dead. and we have shipped the last round of ammunition.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, I think that's where we are. And when Biden or anybody else says, well, if the Russians want to end the war, we'll talk to them, what they're really saying is that if you capitulate, if you surrender to us on our terms, which is why I use the Carthaginian peace, then we'll talk to you. Well, that's absurd. Russia is not going to surrender to the West. That's nonsense. On the contrary, if we push this, the war will simply escalate, and it will find its way into Europe and to the United States, and that's the last thing we want.
You're mentioning the kind of need to talk and have a dialogue that's honest. There's another story, of course. Here's one article that kind of captures it. Euractiv.com says European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has come under fire for publishing and then unpublishing a video containing what appears to be a very high estimate of killed Ukrainian military officers. The backlash came when she put out a video message with an estimated 120,000 Ukrainians had been killed during Russia's war. It's estimated that 20,000 civilians and more than 100,000 Ukrainian military officers have been killed so far, she put in her original version of the video. But she's getting a lot of backlash from saying that. Can you give us an insight as to why this is getting backlash?
Because it contradicts the lie. We need to understand that what's happened is that the United States and British intelligence agencies have created a false narrative. And the media in both of those countries, as well as the media in Western Europe, have been given instructions to repeat this narrative ad nauseum. And all of you have heard it. The Russians are losing. The Russians can't win. The Russians are incompetent. NATO will be victorious. The Ukrainians will win, and on and on and on. This is a big lie. This has been a lie from day one. And Ursula von der Leyen, quite, I guess, unconsciously spoke the truth. She didn't say 100,000 officers. She said 100,000 Ukrainian troops. And she said 20,000 civilians. Well, that may well be true, but now it's over 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers. It's closer to 120,000 Ukrainian soldiers plus probably 20,000 civilians. And we're going to see more civilian deaths because it's a war zone. And that war zone is not going to improve. It's going to become much more lethal. Instead of telling people the truth, which would obviously embarrass President Biden and all of his supporters on the Hill, as well as the current and previous British prime ministers and British Parliament, who all are posturing as moralizing globalists, trying to tell us all how bad and evil we are. As a result, they're not going to release the truth. So she's been told to shut up, back off, and do what she's told, just as General Milley was. But the truth is, what Milley said was accurate, and the truth is that what von der Leyen said was accurate. The Russians aren't losing. They've lost comparatively few troops compared to the Ukrainians. Their exchange rate right now is about 1 Russian for every 8 Ukrainian dead. That's not a good exchange rate if you're going to argue that you're winning the war. That's an exchange rate for someone who is definitely losing.
I see. There's another story that's connected to this fallout from this conflict. BusinessInsider.com says Russia is on track to ship its highest amount of oil products since the war as Europe struggles to wean itself off Russian energy supplies. It goes on to, in the piece, it talks about how Russia is still Europe's largest single refined oil product supplier. And it says Russian diesel-type shipments to Europe this month are about 50% of what Europe purchased overall, meaning the continent remains heavily reliant on Moscow ahead of the EU's ban on Russian oil products in February.
Well, this is also confirmation of something else that I've been saying and others who do not subscribe to this false narrative, and that is that Russia has not been harmed by sanctions. The people that have been harmed the most by sanctions are our allies in Europe and ourselves. I mean, stop and consider the plight of farmers in Europe and the United States and around the world who don't have access to fertilizer. The overwhelming majority of the fertilizer is supplied to the world by Russia and Belarus and to a lesser extent, Ukraine. The same thing is true for wheat and a whole range of other products. The bottom line is that Russia has actually thrived. It's only the top 10 or 15% of the Russian population that is not getting some of the exquisite products that come out of Italy, France, and the United States. I'm talking about things like perfume or leather bags or some other thing, the things that are discretionary items, not things that you need to survive. But the Russian population as a whole, its standard of living is as good as it was when this began. And the Russians have adjusted, and they have found other markets for their fuel, for their energy, for their timber, for their minerals, for everything. So this whole thing from the beginning was a dumb idea because the underlying assumption was that we could somehow or another isolate Russia from the rest of the world. That's absurd. It was never possible. And the Russians clearly were not prepared for a major war, but now they are. And as a result, they're going to build forces in the future that are even more capable and more powerful than what we saw 30 or 40 years ago. And that's the cruelest aspect of this whole thing. The very thing that we said we were going to try to do, which was to weaken Russia by forcing it to fight in Ukraine at the expense of Ukraine, has failed. And what instead we are going to see is a much stronger and more capable Russia than existed at the beginning of this process.
I see. And when you see that this tenor seems to never change, I mean, how does this going to come to a head? We were hoping that perhaps there would be a cooling off and there would be a kind of, like you said, a compromise in terms of trying to resolve this conflict so the bloodshed wouldn't continue. But it doesn't seem to be that's on the mind of those running the show in D.C. Is this
clearly? If you're a Russian, David, what are you going to agree to at this point? I mean, we're offering them a Carthaginian peace. Yeah. You are going to withdraw from all Ukrainian territory. None of your demands or wishes will be met, and Ukraine will join NATO. Well, that's essentially saying if you're willing to show up on the battleship Missouri tomorrow morning in the Baltic Sea and surrender to us, we're happy to talk to you. Well, that's absurd. So it's crazy. So there's not going to be any arrangement at this stage. And what instead is going to happen is the Russians are going to complete the task of annihilating the Ukrainian armed forces, and I suspect they will destroy this government. I'd be very surprised if the Ukrainian leadership survives the next 2 or 3 months. And the outcome is going to be defeat. Defeat for Ukraine, and we and our partners in Europe are going to look ridiculous. Now, there is one possibility, and that is that the Europeans, particularly the Germans, wake up to reality, figure out that they've been lied to about everything, and they suddenly say, that's it, we've had it, we're out. And when that happens, or if that happens, the whole thing collapses in the West. But right now, we're just on the path to certain defeat. And no one wants to admit that. And so the argument is, well, we won't be defeated. We'll just keep sending in more equipment, sending in more cash, try to find more mercenaries that'll go over there and man equipment and fight for the Ukrainians. I don't see that as a winning proposition. I think time is on Russia's side, not on ours. And the Russians live there. We don't. The real issue here is that Americans have got to start paying attention to reality. We have no business in involving ourselves in wars 5,000 or 6,000 miles from our country. Certainly not unless there is something at stake for us. And in this case, there's nothing at stake for us. The only real interest we ever had was in peace. And what we're having and what we're dealing with right now is war that we didn't want and didn't need. It's harming everyone.
Do you see this as the end of the post-World War II era of the world? It seems like this conflict could be the kind of conclusion of, or something different's going to happen, whichever way this goes. That's going to be kind of different.
Well, David, the truth is that this post-World War II order began collapsing the moment the Soviet Union vanished. Yeah. Once the Soviet Union and the supporting Warsaw Pact system all collapsed and fell apart. That was the beginning of the end of the post-World War order. Now what's happened is that since we clung tenaciously to the past and refused to let anything go, we've been trying for the last 30 years to effectively freeze the international system in a way that we see as beneficial to us. Well, it may be beneficial to us in some ways, but it's not beneficial to the rest of the world. The Russians are simply the first ones to stand up and say, that's enough. No more. We're not prepared to be exploited by you financially. We're not prepared to turn our country over to you to be dismembered and destroyed. And we've watched what you've done in other countries. We're not going to let you do that to us. And by the way, the Chinese, the Indians, and dozens of other countries on the planet have reached the same conclusion, which is why when you look at this war, the only people that have been interested in supporting us at all are really our allies in Western Europe and some in Eastern Europe, but not everybody. And once you move out of Europe, you begin to see that the vast majority of countries are either disinterested or actively support Russia.
So, it doesn't seem like the people in D.C. power circles don't seem to really be worried at all about the repercussions of what they're doing there in this region. I mean, let me give you an example, and this might pivot to something that you don't want to talk about, but it is something that the establishment is talking about. The Hill has a story saying NASA chief Bill Nelson, latest official to suggest UFOs have otherworldly origins. And I'm looking at this story because you're talking about the repercussions of this Ukraine conflict, but it's got former CIA Director John Brennan speculated that these UFO objects encountering the Navy could constitute a different form of life. Former CIA Director James Woolsey, longtime UFO skeptic, says this could be something new. John Ratcliffe, Trump's former national intelligence guy. Why are they talking about this instead of talking about the Ukraine conflict?
Well, first of all, it's probably a lot easier to talk about UFOs than it is to talk about the debacle in Ukraine. And as things get worse in Ukraine and it becomes more and more obvious that Russia has achieved its aims and is victorious, we'll change the subject and try to divert everybody's attention into something else. That's usually what we do, David. We did that after Vietnam. We did that after Iraq. We did that after Afghanistan. Suddenly, it's over. We walk away.
Colonel Douglas Macgregor, always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, David. Bye-bye.
We'll be right back after this. Stay tuned. Hello, this is David Gornoski. Hope you're doing well. If you want to call in to weigh in on some of the things that Colonel Douglas Macgregor, our guest, we just had on, you can at 727-587-1040. That's 727-587-1040 to weigh in with your thoughts about the Ukraine conflict and some of the various topics surrounding that issue. You are always going to hear a different angle on this program that nobody else is doing. And this is kind of like an incubator program where we're incubating ideas, we're cultivating ideas, bringing them into fruition, bringing them into the light, and we've had a huge outsized impact in so many different ways that we don't want to trademark. We don't want to copyright. You know what I mean? If everybody wants to talk about Rene Girard, awesome. That's what we want. We want everybody. We were the only guys doing I was the only one doing a radio show podcast about Rene Girard for some time, and it's really caught fire over the years. We want everybody talking about Rene Girard, not just in a token way, but actually understanding how his theory helps us connect the dots between current events and the Bible and Jesus' work in history and how that all plays out. And the same thing for, the new physics paradigm. We want other people talking about what we talk about with Dr. Yu, and they are. We want, when it comes to the way we talk about the seed oil thing and how we connect the science and we connect it to practical living questions and answers and so forth. That's something, again, that we want other people to scale and take. We want our ideas to germinate and blossom. And, yet the world is going to be more attracted to shiny toys and gimmicks and controversy and lunchroom drama. And let me tell you, there's a lot of lunchroom drama to get caught up in. And there's a lot of distractions and personality scandals that you can get caught up in the vortex of. But God has a way of working in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the errors that people make. In the midst, God can use people with broken motives or ignorance or grievous mistakes or errors or sins. He can use those in a way that shifts paradigms and shifts culture to a better place overall. It's interesting how God's art works. We are his artworks, and we have work to do in the way we tell the story of the personhood revolution of Jesus. And there's a lot of talk about a lot of different big idea things coming to fruition right now. I think it's interesting that there is a constant reference back to the characters of so much of the the dramas and the heroes and villains of that World War II era. You think about Stalin, you think about Mao Zedong, you think about Hitler. But one of those is the one that people continue to reference as the end-all, be-all Satan of that era that we're still living in. And that is kind of the grand narrative, the World War II era narrative, that we are still the grandchildren living in that paradigm and still thinking through, okay, well, those were the players in this horrific bloodshed of millions of people dying for collectivism. How do we interpret what those villains and heroes, whether it's America and what they did, whether it's what Japan did, whether it's what Germany, Russia, all these different players are still working out the implications of that new founding moment in our cultural history that we're still living in. And that's why you see this fight, for example, in the Ukraine conflict, where the Western media says that Putin is Hitler reincarnated, which is, again, the worst. They're not saying he's Stalin. You don't hear him say he's Stalin. They don't say he's Chairman Mao. They don't say he's, any of the other killers of recent history and mass murderers, right? But they say he's Hitler because Hitler is the premier villain and murderer, that somehow his murders are distinctive from the murders of these other collectivist thugs that killed millions of people. Why is that? It's because we live in a Christ-haunted society. It's because those other ideologies, because their brand and the way they justified their murders were more completely tethered to the concept of, well, we're helping the poor and the marginalized, and we're trying to protect the weak against the strong capitalists, right? That narrative somehow blinds us to this day and being able to recognize that all of these forms of collective violence are repugnant and against God's image. Because Hitler's narrative that he used, his religion, his pagan cult religion that he used to justify his murders on a huge mass scale, he did it by saying, well, we are better and we are superior to those people, and we will sacrifice our way to prove it, in terms of sacrificing the victims that he persecuted, right? So the question comes down to, how do we get to a point where we can recognize the human dignity of every victim of collectivist violence, period, without this kind of learned hypocrisy by which we have not been able to process the brutal murder evil of the Stalins, of the Chairman Maos, of these other horrific thug figures at the same scale of what we repudiate with Hitler's work. We have to be able to repudiate the whole paradigm if we're going to move past this post-World War II global cultural moment that we're still in. Because the lesson that we need to come out of this paradigm in, and that means leaving this moment, this cultural narrative, is that every human being life is sacred. And that we're not going to play games and make these kind of memory hole games where, well, if you kill in the name of victims, it's bad, it's evil, but it's not going to be vilified to the same degree as killing in the names of being a ethno-narcissist, fascist, right? Communism, fascism, corporatism, globalism, anything that's killing people and harming people and initiating violence against innocent life, all of it must be repudiated. All of it needs to be stopped, okay? Because that's what people who are actually imitating the personhood revolution of Jesus would do. They wouldn't make excuses. They wouldn't squint their eyes when their team or people closer to their team's rhetoric or narrative do something evil. No, they would repudiate it, period. The killing of life is wrong. It is not some kind of joke. It's not some kind of gimmick that you can make go away when your team does it. And that's why I'm sick and tired of compromising in terms of, when I say compromising, our society compromising with the truth and playing these selective games. And you see it in Hollywood, all the films that we continue to watch, even though there are elements of Christ-haunted redemptive elements in protection of the human person. And definitely Christ haunts the box office and will continue to do so in terms of the themes that are explored. Sacrifice. Should you sacrifice your enemy or should you self-sacrifice? But ultimately, they still, the big themes of action films that resonate the most with the masses, they still try to justify, well, my hero gets to kill his rival. So I like Cain, and I think Cain should be able to kill Abel. And then some other team through history says, no, you know what? I think Abel should have ducked, and then he should have really killed Cain, and that would have been Team Abel's triumph, and we would like to start talking about Abel and all the things that he is as our king, right? All this concept stuff that I'm talking about is exactly what's at play in all the headlines you're seeing today and that you will continue to see in perpetuity until we start to learn these lessons and become aware of what it is that Jesus would have us to do. And I think we have to be very cautious about making Jesus, again, an object that we can contain and that we own, and then we trot him out, that we want to be Christian. And the left does this. We referenced it with the Warnock campaign and all the pastors in Georgia lining up to say this is the Christian moment to support this guy. But it happens on the right, too, of using, well, we're Christians, so this is what Christians do. They want to go for this war. They want to go for that regime change, chaos. No. Those who live by the sword die by the sword, and that is not some kind of vain statement. That is a very efficacious description of reality. And what makes Christianity unique is that we who imitate the personhood revolution of Jesus, we don't make exceptions to life being sacred. It is sacred no matter who is doing the killing and what their narrative excuse is, because we are called to see through mythology and see it for the lie that it is. Jesus says Satan, in this case, think of the word Satan as a system of ordering society. Satan has been a liar and a murderer from the beginning. And we have got to understand the repercussions of that the cultural debates, the cultural war, the cultural fights, and the political fights that we have are all downwind from that. You know, they're all downriver, whatever metaphor you want. They're all being fed by that big question that we're being revealed. It's being revealed to the human species slowly but surely. We are God's artwork. And the stories we tell continue to justify our lies and mistakes and sins. And God always seems to find a way to use even the most broken, dumb, stupid mistakes. He still finds a redemptive element, and he pulls it out, and he calls us to do better as a species. And we must do better because time is running out, folks. And the reason why I say that, it's not to be a gimmick. It's to be completely honest with you. Time is running out. We don't have time to be suckered into personality conflicts. And again, lunchroom trauma. We have to go beyond that because the dollar is falling apart. Whichever way it happens, whether it's an immediate collapse that's catastrophic, as we've seen in history, it happens with the Soviet Union, it happens with other countries, Zimbabwe, other stories you can learn from. Countries in South America, other places know what happens when you debase a currency. Or maybe it happens in a slow, gradual transition towards some kind of digital currency that the government wants to roll out. But whatever it is, folks, people at the top who run the politicians, including the presidents, the people who run the government and the multinational corporations that see the government as simply their property, but want to socialize the losses whenever they need to you. They see you as cattle. They see you as less than human. And that doesn't mean we scapegoat them as, well, if you're in government, you're the problem. No, government is not some kind of alien entity that has tricked us into allowing us to, into being what it is. We human beings love idolatry. We love to raise up gods. We love to raise up kings. We love to raise up heroes and then give them special privilege to be able to do whatever the hell they want to do until they get on our nerves, and then we sacrifice them. That's what we do over and over and over again since the dawn of time and before. And that's what's going on in this moment, at this post-World War II era that we've lived in. People are pointing the fingers. No, you're Satan. No, you're Satan. No, you're Team Satan. That's all they do, You got, Canada, condemning what's going on in China. That's evil to do that to protesters. And we see all the clips of what they did to protesters. Sick. Point the finger. Accuse the other of what you do. Project your sins onto the other. That's the failure of scapegoating, and it will continue ad nauseum into hell on earth, folks. We have got to wake up. So yes, the answer is Jesus all the way through, but we have to be serious when we approach the subject of Jesus and not keep going back to the same Sunday school false or just limited frameworks of thinking about Jesus. Because if you only think of Jesus as a theological figure, you will miss the point of Jesus' life. He said he was the Son of Man more than he said he was the Son of God, which means that not only does he reveal who God is and who God's character is, but he also emphasizes in his life action, more than not, he reveals who we are. Because we need to know who we are in order to figure out how to properly see God. If we're deluded about who we are as a species, and what we individuals are guilty of and what we're capable of, if we're deluded by listening to false ideologies and false philosophies that tickle the ear and justify violence and coercion and envy and decadence, if we continue to listen to false paradigms and false prophets, we will continue to be deluded in continuing the madness of endless living by the sword and dying by the sword. And Jesus said that do not be like the Gentiles who lord over their subjects. We are not to do that. We are not to lord over people. We are not to resist evil with violence. We are to desire mercy, not sacrifice. And that should leaven the way we deal with everything in society. We should not be fixated on, well, I'm with this team and I'm with that person, and therefore I'm going to, compromise my principles, my character, my conscience, whatever, because, well, they did that war, but that's okay. They didn't do the other war. You see that all the time, that kind of thinking, right? Well, they wanted to have, look what Trump did with Yemen. He went on with the Yemen conflict on behalf of Saudi Arabia. This is thuggish. This is not Christian. He's saying that he wants to, give the death penalty to drug dealers. That's not Christian. That's not how you deal with that. I understand the general principle if you want to talk about giant, leaders of cartels. But again, you'd have to, if you go up the top of the hierarchy of drug cartels, you'd get to the United States government, wouldn't you? Oh. You'd get to Pfizer, who he uses their executives and appoints them to be the FDA commissioner, just like all the other presidents. Is that really the change we want? Is that really the change that you want to get motivated by? And I understand that there can be incremental progress with these things, but when we sink and we get our hearts enraptured by these limited, not Christian things, then at some point we've become idolatrous. So let's pursue the personhood revolution of Jesus. Some people say, don't say that Jesus is revolutionary. Revolution is violent. Okay, I've said that too, but we can redeem the word revolution because it's a language that the average person understands in a way that hits their heart, because we, particularly here in America, we're born in a revolutionary spirit. And that's the thing that we have to keep in mind at all times, that we have to be able to work with people where they're at. I'm not asking for absolute puritanism or, perfectionism, but I'm just saying that we have got to take the Jesus story serious, because we're seeing the end of an era, and this thing can end in a very, very bloody, horrific way, more than it already is. And it already is. People point out all the hypocrisies. Some folks have pointed out, how can you be condemning what they're doing to, Balenciaga if you are doing this or that? But the point is, there's condemnation and guilt for everything all around. But we've got to be able to anchor back, get on our feet, and imitate a blueprint that actually works and creates order and creates peace and creates a foundation for freedom and flourishing. And there's only one place that you can find that, and that is the rock on which Jesus has built his movement around the globe. Now, I know as I say that, many of you might be listening right now and say, oh, finally, now make sure you say my team right here. Okay, say my team, say my church denomination, and then you've got it. No. I'm not going there, okay? I don't care about playing that game. There's a universal movement of people who are trying to imitate Jesus, and many of them do not exist in any church, organized, or house, whatever you want. They're not in either, but their hearts are pricked by the Holy Spirit. Their hearts are pricked by, what is the word Holy Spirit? What does that word mean? It means defender. It means the defender of the world. Jesus said when he's going to send that spirit of defense, that would contend for the faith in a way that would vindicate people and expose the lies of the world's version of justice. And that's exactly what's happening in history. Ever since he said that's what's going to happen, that's exactly what has taken place. He's the advocate. He's the defender. And he's the defender of all human beings. We don't make exceptions based on race or gender, any of that stuff. That's not our rules at play. This is God's rules. And he does not make he's not a respecter of persons in the sense of playing favorites. And that's why we have to get serious when we want to talk about following Jesus. I am so ecstatic that more and more people are talking about putting Jesus first. But let's make sure that we get that right and that we don't turn it into another gimmick that always ends up redirecting us back to half-truths in prison and war and suffering. We have to get serious. But the advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things and will remind you of everything I have said to you. And he will, and that's what the Bible says. It says other things. But what that means is that we have an obligation to defend the truth that the Holy Spirit reveals in our conscience and not to numb our conscience to go along and get along. And that goes for anybody who wants to be in a political campaign or movement or ideology. We have to leaven everything we say to the standard of Christ. And I'm excited and thrilled at the opportunities that lie ahead as people start to bring the conversation back to the focus consciously. Because it's been happening unconsciously all this time, but it's consciously coming to our minds to say, you know what? We need God's mercy, not sacrifice. We need a reality that wakes up to where we came from, who we are as a people, and where history is going. The master of history himself, Jesus, gave us the blueprint that we get to live out. And we can live it out in a very awkward and very ugly and vicious way where we go kicking and screaming into the future, and it continues to create the same bloodshed that we saw in the 20th century and we continue to see in the 21st century, where we can say, you know what, I am sick of this stuff. It's making us all sick. It's making us all ill. It's making us all poor. It's making us all vapid and numbed out and addicted to every kind of stupid, ugly feeling and terrible passion one can imagine. And I don't want it. And I'm changing my heart and mind, and I'm going in a different direction. That's what we have as an opportunity. Let's make the right choice as we consider this moment. We'll be back for hour 2, but for now, I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.